I should have seen it coming. The nagging, the constant picking, the nitpicking over things that felt microscopic until her voice turned them into full-blown catastrophes. I've been with Peggy for 3 years now, but some days it feels more like a lifetime sentence served in hourly doses of complaints and half-muttered insults. The funny thing is, I was convinced for the longest time that she'd grow out of it. Like it was some phase, a rough patch, a temporary blip in an otherwise solid relationship. I kept telling myself that. It's just her job stressing her out. It's just her family drama spilling over. It's just me being overly sensitive. But lately, the excuses I've been feeding myself feel hollow. Like I'm trying to fill a sinkhole with dried leaves and hoping it holds. She's at it again tonight. Peggy's voice is rising and falling from the living room, her words a tangled mess of irritation and condescension. I'm in the kitchen, scraping burnt rice out of a pot and trying not to take her tone personally. It's about money this time. It's always about money. Why didn't you ask for a raise, Brandon? You've been at that job long enough. If you just pushed a little harder, maybe we wouldn't be scraping by. It's the same argument, recycled and dressed up like something fresh. But I don't bother saying that. I've learned my lesson by now. When Peggy gets into one of these moods, she's like a wrecking ball swinging with no regard for what's left standing afterward. I stare down at the pot, imagining her voice bouncing off the stainless steel and ricocheting back at her. I used to argue back. Used to defend myself, tell her that I'm doing my best, that the promotion will come when it comes, that life isn't a straight line you can just yank into the shape you want. But I've been wearing down, piece by piece. Instead of fighting, I just nod, let her unload, and try to let it roll off my shoulders like rain off a cheap coat. But tonight, something's different. Maybe it's the edge in her voice, the way she keeps circling back to the same point like a predator waiting for me to slip up. I just don't understand why you're so complacent, she says, and her words sound like the click of a trap snapping shut. Complacent. As if holding down a steady job, keeping the bills paid, and showing up every damn day isn't enough. As if the problem is me, my lack of drive, my supposed laziness. It's not like I don't have ambitions. It's just that life has a way of grinding you down until you forget what you were reaching for in the first place. I was content, once. I remember a time when Peggy's smile was enough to make the worst days feel manageable. But now, that smile's more like a rare artifact, something that only gets dusted off for public appearances, when there's an audience to impress. I can't remember the last time she looked at me like she used to, eyes bright and full of affection instead of that weary disdain she's perfected. And I'm just sitting here, feeling like a fool for still trying to make it work. Because deep down, there's a part of me clinging to the hope that Peggy will wake up one day and realize I've been doing everything I can. That she'll see me for who I am, not just the flaws she's been magnifying for the past 3 years. But it's getting harder to convince myself that day will ever come. I catch glimpses of her now, talking on her phone with a voice softened to silk, or her fingers tapping out texts with a quickness that feels secretive. I tell myself it's nothing. I've got no proof of anything, just suspicions gnawing away at the edges of my sanity. Still, something's off. Something's been off for a while now, and I've been too busy playing the dutiful boyfriend to acknowledge it. Maybe it's Peggy. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's both of us, grinding against each other like gears that just don't fit anymore. And yet, I stay. Because leaving feels like admitting failure, and I've spent too much time fighting to let go now. So I stay quiet, let her vent until she's worn herself out. I scrape the last of the rice into the trash and wash the pot with methodical strokes, focusing on the simple, mindless task. It's better than listening to her list off all the ways I've fallen short. Better than acknowledging the doubt that's been growing like a shadow between us. Better than admitting I'm starting to hate the sound of her voice. And still, I stay. Because hope is a stubborn parasite, and I've never been good at cutting things loose. She started coming home later than usual, her eyes a little brighter, her voice a little too sweet. I noticed the changes but shrugged them off, chalking them up to her unpredictable mood swings. Peggy had always been mercurial, blowing hot and cold like some unpredictable storm. It was just her way, I told myself, another phase I needed to ride out until things leveled off again. But something about her felt different this time. There was a nervous energy to her movements, a gleam of excitement she tried to stifle whenever she noticed me watching. She'd disappear into the bedroom with her phone more often, murmuring into it like she was guarding a precious secret. I tried not to let it bother me, told myself I was being paranoid. But doubt has a way of growing roots once it's planted. I found myself glancing at her phone whenever she left it unattended, my mind leaping to worst-case scenarios with each notification she snatched away before I could even catch a glimpse. Maybe I could have just asked her what was going on. Maybe I could have trusted her. But instead, I found myself making excuses to leave work early, circling back home just to see where she went when she claimed to be out running errands. She'd head out in the evenings, saying she needed to clear her mind or go for a walk, but the walks kept getting longer. One night, I followed her out of the apartment, trailing her through the streets like some amateur detective too desperate to confront the truth head-on. I stayed back far enough to keep her from noticing, ducking behind parked cars and pretending to scroll through my phone whenever she glanced over her shoulder. My heart raced with every step, a wild, sick sort of anticipation pushing me onward. She ended up at a small clinic on the edge of town, the kind of place with a flickering neon sign and a tired receptionist who barely glanced up as she walked in. I stood across the street, my hands shaking, mind spinning with all the possibilities. Why would she be here? Was she sick? Hurt? The anxiety twisted my stomach into knots. I couldn't bring myself to go inside, couldn't face whatever explanation might be waiting for me. So I just stood there until she came back out, her expression strangely serene. I rushed home ahead of her, pretending I hadn't seen a thing, trying to act natural even as my thoughts spiraled in a dozen directions at once. The answer came a few days later, in the form of a delicate little smile Peggy wore like a secret she was finally ready to share. She sat me down, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap, her eyes wide and uncertain. And then she told me she was pregnant. The words hit me like a shot of adrenaline, every nerve in my body lighting up with pure, undiluted joy. I couldn't stop grinning, couldn't stop babbling about how perfect everything was going to be. Suddenly, all the fights, all the tension, all the doubt seemed like nothing more than temporary hurdles on the path to something bigger, something meaningful. I saw our future stretching out before us, vivid and bright and filled with the kind of happiness I'd almost given up hoping for. Peggy looked relieved by my reaction, her shoulders easing as if she'd been bracing herself for disappointment. I didn't even think to ask why. All I could think about was the child we were going to have, the family we were going to build together. She was still talking, her voice low and shaky but laced with something close to enthusiasm. Marriage, she said. She wanted to do things right, to give our child a proper home, a stable foundation. The thought of marrying her had crossed my mind before, but I'd always pushed it aside, convinced we needed to work through our issues before making such a commitment. But now it felt like the only logical step, the only way to make everything feel solid and real. We spent hours talking, making plans, sketching out a future that suddenly felt within reach. I didn't even notice the way her eyes drifted whenever I started talking about the baby's room or the kind of crib we'd need. I was too lost in the dream, too caught up in the rush of euphoria to notice the hesitation in her voice or the way she kept fiddling with her phone like it was some kind of lifeline. For once, Peggy seemed happy, genuinely happy, and I was willing to do whatever it took to keep her that way. We agreed to start making arrangements, to figure out how to make this all work. I kept thinking about the wedding, the baby, the life we were finally going to build together. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like everything was going to be okay. But the thing about happiness is it never warns you before it slips through your fingers. The wedding was everything Peggy had dreamed of, or so she said, her voice brimming with excitement as she described all the details she wanted. It felt surreal, standing there in a suit that didn't quite feel like mine, surrounded by relatives who probably thought we'd never make it to this point. Peggy had her hair done up in some intricate style, her dress flowing in white and perfect in the way magazine photos always seem to be. She glowed that day, radiating happiness and charm as she flitted from conversation to conversation, basking in the compliments and the attention. The announcement about the pregnancy went over better than I'd expected, with Peggy's mother crying tears of joy and my own parents grinning like they'd just won the lottery. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. The fights, the doubt, the nights spent wondering if we were even meant to be, all of it seemed like some bad dream I could finally wake up from. We danced, laughed, clinked glasses until our throats were raw from toasting to the future. Peggy played the role of the happy bride flawlessly, her smile never wavering even when I caught her staring off into the distance with a look I couldn't quite place. But I brushed it off. I was determined to believe we were heading towards something better. The first few days of marriage felt like slipping into a new skin, awkward and exhilarating all at once. Peggy alternated between affectionate and distant, her mood swinging from warmth to chilly detachment faster than I could keep up. But I convinced myself it was just the stress of everything, the looming reality of parenthood hanging over us both. I tried to be patient, tried to listen when she snapped at me for some minor thing and tried to make her laugh when she seemed lost in her own thoughts. I chalked it all up to nerves and let myself believe it would pass. Then, just as I was starting to relax into this new life, he showed up. It was early afternoon, the sun beating down on our small front porch as I heard the knock. I opened the door to find a man standing there, mid-30s maybe, with a nervous energy that made his fingers twitch against his jeans. He introduced himself as Fred, his voice steady but his eyes darting around like he expected someone to lunge at him any second. Peggy walked into the room just as Fred was explaining that he needed to talk to her. The moment she saw him, her whole body went rigid, her eyes narrowing into something sharp and cold. She told him to leave, her voice low and furious, the kind of anger that usually meant I'd said something unforgivable. But Fred didn't budge. He just stood there, staring at her like he'd come too far to back down now. Then he said something that made my stomach twist into a knot. He claimed he was the father of Peggy's child. Not me. Him. His words hung in the air like a thick fog, choking the room with something I couldn't even begin to name. Peggy's face went white, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the right words to defend herself. I felt something hot and jagged tear through me, some combination of disbelief and fury and fear all tangled together. I told Fred to leave, practically shoved him out the door before he could say anything else. He went, but not before throwing one last glance over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto Peggy's with something close to desperation. The door slammed shut behind him and for a long moment, neither of us moved. Peggy's hands were shaking. She tried to explain, her words tripping over themselves like they were trying to escape before I could pin them down. She insisted Fred was lying, that he was just some obsessed man trying to ruin her happiness. I wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. So I buried the doubt and pretended it was all just some cruel joke. But doubt doesn't stay buried. It festers, whispers, grows roots that worm their way into every thought. I tried to move past it, focused on preparing for the baby, trying to make everything feel normal. But Fred's words lingered, circling my mind like vultures. Peggy's behavior didn't help. She became withdrawn, snappish, retreating into herself whenever I tried to bring up what had happened. We started arguing more, the same old wounds reopening with each exchange until it felt like we were tearing each other apart one piece at a time. The only thing that kept me going was the thought of the baby. My child. The one bright spot in an increasingly dark and tangled mess. When the day finally came and Peggy went into labor, I shoved all my doubts aside and focused on her, on helping her through the pain and fear. When they placed the tiny, squirming infant in my arms, everything else melted away. I felt a joy so overwhelming it made my eyes sting. But the doubts crept back, subtle at first, then louder and more insistent until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I tried to brush them off, but Fred's voice kept echoing in my mind. Finally, when the baby was about a month old, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the clinic and requested a DNA test, my hands trembling as I handed over the samples, my stomach churning with guilt and something darker. The wait for the results felt like an eternity, each day stretching out longer than the one before. Peggy grew more distant, her eyes flickering with something that looked too much like fear whenever I mentioned the baby's health or resemblance. When the results finally arrived, I opened the envelope with fingers that felt numb. The words blurred before me, but the message was unmistakable. Fred was right. The child I'd been cradling, feeding, loving with everything I had, it wasn't mine. The betrayal hit me like a fist to the chest, leaving me breathless and hollow. All those months of hope, all those dreams I'd built on a foundation of lies. I dropped the paper and stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down so hard I thought it might crush me. Peggy had lied. Fred had been telling the truth. And now I was left standing in the ruins of a life I thought I was building. I couldn't let it go. The truth felt like some poisonous thorn lodged deep in my chest, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it burned. It wasn't enough to have the proof in black and white, to know that the child I'd spent months preparing for wasn't mine. I needed to understand how it had all happened, how I had been played for a fool while Peggy looked me in the eye and spoke about our future with the same lips she used to lie. The sleepless nights started blending together, the days unraveling into a blur of bitterness and confusion. Peggy acted as if nothing had changed. She went through the motions of motherhood with a strained smile, her eyes dodging mine whenever I tried to bring up what we both knew had torn us apart. She had stopped even trying to explain herself, like she'd given up convincing me that Fred had been some deranged liar. I realized it wouldn't be enough to just confront her. She had built her lies so carefully, layer upon layer of deception coated in sweetness and guilt. No, I needed to hear it from him. The man who had broken into my life with a few words and left everything I thought I knew in ruins. I decided to find Fred. I didn't bother telling Peggy what I was doing. Her silence was permission enough. Tracking him down was easier than I expected. A couple of online searches, a few calls to places he'd mentioned during that first encounter, and eventually, I found myself parked outside a shabby apartment building on the edge of the city. My hands were clenched around the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my pulse thudding in my ears. I expected anger to drive me forward, but all I felt was this sick, desperate need to finally understand. When I knocked on his door, Fred answered with a wary expression, his eyes flickering with recognition. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as if he expected a fight. I told him I wasn't there to cause trouble, that I just needed the truth, the whole truth, from his perspective. Something in my voice must have convinced him because he let me in, his suspicion easing into something that almost resembled relief. His apartment was cluttered, mismatched furniture crammed into a space too small to hold it all. He gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing, arms crossed over my chest like they could shield me from whatever I was about to hear. Fred seemed hesitant at first, his words stumbling over themselves before he found his rhythm. But once he started, the story came pouring out like he'd been waiting for someone to listen all along. He told me he'd met Peggy months before the wedding, that she had been friendly, flirtatious even, but also guarded. He claimed she had painted me as some inattentive, distracted man more focused on his own failures than on her happiness. According to Fred, she'd acted like she was starved for attention, desperate for someone to make her feel valued. He admitted he'd fallen for her faster than he should have, that he'd mistaken her loneliness for something genuine. I wanted to scoff at his sincerity, to call him a liar or a manipulator, but his voice held none of the arrogance I expected. It was just, sad. He said Peggy had insisted their relationship was nothing serious at first, that she was only looking for a distraction from her troubles. But things escalated, grew tangled, until Fred found himself caring about her far more than he'd intended. He showed me the texts. Months worth of messages, photos, voicemails Peggy had sent him with a frequency that made my stomach twist. Sweet nothings mixed with complaints about me, confessions of doubt and insecurity painted over with affection I hadn't known she was capable of showing anymore. Fred scrolled through them slowly, his thumb trembling as he passed each screen over to me. The truth spilled out between us like oil slicking over water. Fred claimed he had never meant to hurt anyone. He said he had tried to convince Peggy to be honest with me, to come clean before things spiraled out of control. He wanted her to leave me, he admitted, but not like this. He wanted her to make her own decision, not to keep using me as a safety net while she kept him hidden away like some shameful secret. When he found out about the pregnancy, Fred said he was overjoyed. He'd wanted to be part of the child's life from the beginning, but Peggy kept him at arm's length, promising him she'd find a way to make things right. But as the months passed and she continued pretending everything was normal with me, Fred grew frustrated, desperate even. He showed me messages he'd sent her begging her to tell me the truth, to end things cleanly before the baby was born. Peggy had ignored most of them. When she did reply, it was always with some vague promise or angry dismissal. But what hurt most was the part that came next. Fred told me that Peggy hadn't wanted to leave me. She'd admitted to him more than once that she was hoping I'd be the one to end it, that I'd grow tired of her mood swings and constant criticism and walk away on my own. She wanted to be the victim, the one left behind so she could pretend her betrayal was justified. Peggy had calculated everything. She had built her own miserable reality and then blamed me for not pulling her out of it. Fred said he had tried one last time to make her choose before the wedding, but she had shut him down completely, telling him to stay away until she figured out what to do. But of course, she never did. When Fred finally showed up at our door after the wedding, it was out of desperation. He said he'd come there to force her to admit the truth, to tell me everything before the baby was born. I listened to all of it in silence, my anger simmering just beneath the surface, but not at Fred. He had been selfish, reckless, and deluded, but he had never lied to me. Peggy had. Over and over, until the lies were all that held us together. Fred asked if there was anything else I needed to know, his eyes hollow and resigned. I shook my head, thanked him for his honesty, and left without another word. As I drove away, I realized something with cold clarity. Peggy had never intended for the truth to come out. She would have kept me trapped in her web of manipulation forever if it suited her. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I left without a word. The silence was the sharpest knife I could wield, the absence of confrontation my first calculated move. Peggy returned home one evening to find the apartment stripped of my presence, my clothes gone, my belongings packed and hauled off without a single goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a message. I simply disappeared like smoke blown away by the first hint of wind. The divorce papers were filed quietly, the legal proceedings handled from a distance. She fought, of course. Called and texted incessantly, her tone oscillating between pleading and fury. But I refused to respond. She had already drained me of every ounce of trust, every thread of compassion. This was business now. Cold, measured, relentless. I settled into a new life in a city that bore no resemblance to the place I had left behind. I took a new job, buried myself in work, channeled every ounce of pain into productivity. But I didn't forget. Every success, every advancement, was another stone laid into the foundation of something far greater than mere recovery. It was revenge, pure and unyielding, my only guiding star. I researched, planned, and plotted, letting the bitterness fester until it transformed into something sharper, something useful. 5 years of grinding, clawing my way up the ladder until I was in a position of power, a place from which I could finally reach back and take everything from those who had torn my life apart. I had known where Peggy worked all along. I kept tabs on her, careful not to make my presence known. She had landed a cushy position at a mid-sized company, the sort of place that provided her with stability and the illusion of success. I made it my mission to acquire that company, every move deliberate, every investment precise. It took years of maneuvering, backroom negotiations, and leveraging every connection I'd made. But I did it. The acquisition went through without her even realizing who was behind it. Her face when I walked into that boardroom for the first time was a masterpiece of shock and terror. I took my time, letting her squirm under the weight of her own humiliation before I finally uttered the words that would end her career. She was terminated on the spot, security escorting her out of the building as her colleagues whispered and stared. I watched her leave with a calmness that felt like steel poured into my veins. One down, one to go. Fred was harder to reach, slippery in the way people who've lost everything tend to be. He had drifted from job to job, never quite finding his footing, his reputation stained by whispers of infidelity and betrayal. But I was patient. I had contacts by then, resources that allowed me to pull strings from a distance. I needed his downfall to be absolute, something that would leave him with no hope of clawing his way back. It started with a few subtle manipulations. Opportunities he couldn't quite grasp slipping through his fingers, rumors that seemed to spring from nowhere and spread like wildfire. But it wasn't enough. I needed something definitive, something that would bury him beyond recovery. Through a series of carefully cultivated connections, I found someone willing to plant evidence in his apartment. Drugs, the kind that carried mandatory sentencing and destroyed any chance of rebuilding a life. The police raid happened a week later. Fred hauled out of his dingy little apartment in handcuffs, his protests drowned out by the flashing lights and shouting officers. The news spread quickly, his name splashed across headlines that painted him as a danger to society. No one would believe his claims of innocence. His past, his mistakes, his tangled involvement with Peggy, they all served to paint him as a man whose own recklessness had finally caught up with him. I read the reports with a detachment that would have frightened the man I used to be. But that man was dead, buried beneath years of calculated vengeance and relentless ambition. Fred was gone, locked away in a cell where he couldn't hurt anyone else. Peggy was ruined, her reputation shredded, her career a distant memory. I had torn their lives apart the way they had torn mine. And yet, as I sat in my corner office overlooking the city skyline, a hollow ache twisted through me, something that felt dangerously close to regret. I had spent so many years consumed by revenge that I hadn't stopped to consider what I might be left with once it was done. The victory tasted bitter, the triumph dulled by the realization that I had built my entire life around destruction. But even then, as I stared out at the world I had conquered, I couldn't bring myself to feel remorse. They had taken everything from me. And I had simply returned the favor.